everyone for being a part of this. It's been lots of fun for me and certainly very interesting. I do hope the takeaway, at least in part, is we keep asking questions and realizing that there's a lot more out there than we realize. I'm going to do a little share screen like I did last week and jump into some of the stuff, but there's so much stuff that's here that it'll probably be a really quick overview, and then just Josh and Dwayne jump in where you want to. If I can find what I'm looking for. I think that's it. Maybe not. No. Sorry. Yeah. All right. So I think that this is if nothing else, this is really the main point. Antithesis, no. Extension, yes. If you don't remember anything else, remember that. And it's I think a really helpful framing of really a lot of what we've been doing and the various chapters that we've looked at. You know, for me anyway, when I talk with particularly Bible groups in a Christian context, I do hear what the authors talk about in terms of people who say, you know, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this stuff. And I understand again that that's something that has been a part of the way that the Christian tradition has taught people. You know, Isaiah was foretelling Jesus, the prophets were doing this. And so it's inevitable that many people will think that way. But thankfully, you know, because of relationships with Josh and other rabbis, I've been very fortunate to be able to say, well, maybe not. Maybe Isaiah was talking about something totally different. And maybe instead of, you know, just really kind of almost unthinkingly say, this is what it means, we're offered an opportunity to step back from the text and to think about or hopefully to suspend our assumptions and to engage at a different level. And this has to do as well with, again, those real broad strokes of how we see Hebrew scripture and for Christians, the New Testament, that, you know, I've heard verbatim people say that the God of the Old Testament is wrathful and the God of the New Testament is graceful. And, you know, it's really, I will just say, okay, we got to stop. That's not what we're talking about. You know, and really what it reflects is people, I think for all of us, you know, not knowing those stories because, you know, growing up, I might have been taught that. But the moment you read Hosea, the moment you read Genesis, the moment you read the prophets, you read Jeremiah, you can't say that God is this wrathful reality, and that's all there is in that, you know, in those books. There's so much mercy, faithfulness, grace, love, you know, and that's so to me, what I say to Christians is to say, no, the God is consistent throughout. Jesus is a reflection of that reality, but it's a reflection of, if we see it as grace and mercy, it's a reflection of the grace and mercy that's always been there. And I think that, again, this chapters on an eye for an eye, lex talionis, as it's known, gets back at that. The Sermon on the Mount gets at this whole thing about, Jesus isn't and the antithesis of Hebrew scripture and whatever came before, but rather as an extension. And they talk about it in terms of that, Jesus says this, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. And I love the phrasing that they use about, this extension that Jesus is about is he's doing the Jewish thing because he's Jewish. And what do Jews do? You interpret, you wrestle with the text. And that's something that I think that Christians actually have a lot to learn in that regard, and would benefit so much, because somewhere along the way, we got the idea that you're supposed to have the answer. And I think part of it is because Christians see Jesus as so important that he is the answer. So then there must be an answer to everything. And the reality is that no, there are more questions raised by the things that we can ascertain. And even when Jesus may be an answer for us as Christians, there is proof positive in the world that clearly we all don't agree on what that answer is, because there are so many different forms and expressions of Christianity. So even though people will say Jesus is the Christ in their mind, what that means is very different from parish to parish and tradition to tradition. So yeah, we should stop saying that we have the answer, and hopefully show a little more humility and recognize that that's the place where there's so much fertile ground to really dig into our own tradition, as well as understand and respect and honor the traditions around us. Again, let's talk about at the bottom of the slide, the mischaracterizations. Judaism is legalistic and retributive, and Jesus is a pacifist. Okay, that's not the case. So they talk about the teachings on murder, adultery, divorce, oath making, and taking, and love of your neighbor. Again, Jesus is not the end of the law, but the fulfillment of that law, and actually, again, moves us into more interpretive work. This is something I thought was interesting too. This mischaracterization of number 2. The authors reference this whole thing about that Christianity is caught up into belief, and perhaps I would imagine, a Jewish reality is more about what you do. And I think they're right in the sense that, we probably fall out in those ways, but I do think that, well, Christianity does have, again, a complicated history with that. And so the book of Hebrews is one of the books in the New Testament that talks about not just like mental assent or again, trust as is faith, as in trust or belief, but really it's about that we have to, faith without works is dead, is the phrase that is used in that book. And I think it also gets at the root of what we think about in terms of faith. I think for many people, particularly probably post-Enlightenment, they think of it as, again, intellectual assent to certain things, like what we talked about in the past: virgin birth, crucifixion, resurrection, the relationship of God with the person Jesus, and Jesus as the Christ, where really what faith means, the Greek root of it, is all about trust. It's relational. It's how do I have the relationship with my wife that I have? It's built on evidence of commitment to one another, and those acts that have accrued over the years. But it at a very fundamental level, it's all about trust. It's not about, all the things that I can believe or intellectually or rationally assent to. Um, and then there's a heresy called antinomianism in the Christian tradition. And so nomos is the Greek word for law. And these were the folks who were so enamored of, basically that for freedom, Christ has set you free. And if, Christ does everything, then there's nothing that you have to do. And they were very libertine, right? It's like, hey, I don't have to do anything. And, the tradition said, hold on, that's going a little too far. Let's rein it in. It really is this balance of trust, and then also because of the trust, then those actions, there's the root of the actions. Those they will certainly follow, so that we need to have both. Also, I was talking with Josh just a little bit before we got started that if you read the Gospels, particularly like Matthew's Gospel, and he's probably writing to a community. Matthew, the writer of Matthew, is writing to a community that's probably predominantly Jewish, and they're struggling with the question about, like, what does it mean to be Christian, and what does it mean to be Jewish in the first century, and can you be both? And clearly there were people who were doing that. There were, the families will be divided was, well, there were people who were part of going to synagogue, or, part of the community, Jewish community in the first century. And then probably were going to somebody's house and they were remembering some of the stories about Jesus, and they might have shared a meal. And at some point there was a crisis moment, and we talked about it last week with the destruction of the temple was probably one of those major moments. But the author of Matthew is trying to deal with this question of, like, well, what does it mean to be Christian? And they weren't even called Christians then; they were called followers of the way. And the Pharisees get a raw deal in my mind, because in Matthew's gospel especially, they're seen as kind of the thorn in Jesus's side, and he's always arguing with them, and they're always challenging him. And the reality is that he probably had more in common with the Pharisees than anyone. They were kind of the rabbis of that time, and they were of a specific type. The Sadducees were people who were born into that place, and they were probably more well off, whereas the Pharisees were more egalitarian. You were meritocratic, if you will, and they had thoughts about resurrection and those types of things. So again, what Jesus is saying isn't radically different than a lot of what the Pharisees were also saying. So I think sometimes when Christians read the Gospels, they see Jesus and the Pharisees as like this. And I think that actually, perhaps another way of thinking about it is that they were parts of a family, and they were having an intra-family squabble. And as sometimes we do when we fight with our families, they get a little bit heated.
And can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Sorry, there were so many sects, SECTS, at that time. Those were just two of them, and so including the Essenes and others, and the aristocracy in the temple, the priests. So it definitely was churning. But what I found so fascinating on page 185, before we leave the point 4 that you have here, is the point that's made that Jesus is both following in the same ways of the Pharisees in terms of the stringent behavior codes for the in-group, because they have to set that example, and the Essenes were even more stringent. They were celibate. But at the same, and also in some ways, Jesus was harsher. So when we talk about the legal threshold of the Old Testament, God, of focusing on law, and the New Testament being all about love, that may be true in some ways, and the reverse may be true as well. But what we have here is the assertion, as he puts it, how ironic, Jesus promotes practices that have harsher prescriptions than the Pharisees' mandate. That he's not abrogating the Torah, he's not superseding it, anything like that. It's just extending it. And then he brings up the point later on of the fence around the Torah, which is a common rabbinic concept. You may have that down here in your slides. The siag LaTorah in Hebrew. It is found everywhere, and it has to do with anything that makes a law more strict in order to make sure that you don't that this fence will not let you get to the core law. For instance, it says in the Torah we're not allowed to seethe or boil a baby goat, in its mother's milk. I mean, that's the basis of some of the kosher laws of separating milk and meat. It never says anything in the Torah about separating milk and meat. It never says anything about cheeseburgers. That's a siyag l'Torah. That's a fence around the Torah. It doesn't even mention chicken as being meat, but the rabbis added chicken because it looks like meat. So if you don't eat chicken burgers with cheese, then you'll definitely not have a baby goat, consuming it with chowder, with its mother's milk, which is all that it's talking about. So you have all these fences around the Torah that you see here in the Sermon on the Mount as well.
That's great. Thanks, Josh. And I think this thing about using the exact words, but it's about how we interpret it. It really is that and I think the authors get at this. There's so much to look at. I mean, there's one way of reading text is just simply at face value. What does the text say? And that's the easiest place to start. But then we start to, it's kind of like an excavation, right? You just start digging around and you learn about the context, you learn about the history, you learn about the language, you learn about the interpretations that have come before. And all of those things, impact how we read these things. So they get into more of that as we go along. And as you were talking about, the fence around the Torah is one of the things that comes up. They do talk about, again, the Sermon on the Mount, the elements that Jesus is addressing. And the ones with the D's on them, they're part of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. So he just brings those up.
Can I?
Yeah.
I think it's better for this chapter to go point by point, because otherwise, to return to all these things, will get confusing. So, murder by extension, anger. I find that to be fascinating, because nowhere in the Torah, I mean, rabbinic ethics would say that anger is not a good thing, that excessive anger drains us of our potential for love, and it clouds our eyes, no question about it. But it seems like Jesus here in the sermon and just in general is saying that you have to avoid anger, because that's the way to avoid murder. It's like it's a slippery slope. It's a siag l'Torah. It's a fence around the Torah. Again, if you never get angry, you won't murder. I mean, I'm just, this is how I interpret it. Maybe that's not totally correct. But I found that fascinating, because I don't disagree with it in some ways. But on the other hand, you run into danger, in that it's if you think that anger is equal in a sense to murder as a sin, then once you get angry, you can almost fall into the trap of, okay, I'm angry anyway. I'm not saying I might as well murder, but it makes that slippery slope even slipperier.
Absolutely. And I think that as we get into the latter part of what we're talking about, the eye for an eye, to me, I found their little the review of some of the the Mishnah, and Talmudic stuff was really interesting, and just shows you how, they were talking about, well, is talion onus, is that is it physical or is it monetary, and how do you make the distinctions? And again, it's just, you really open up Pandora's box. And I think that, right, maybe it's it's a simplistic way of thinking, but um, the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking about love, Josh, and that Jesus kind of condenses that down in his teachings in the Gospels about, love God and love neighbor, and on this are the law and the prophets. Depending on how you think about love, and right, we have one word in the English language for love, and even the Greeks have agape, eros, filial. There are just any number of ways of thinking about that reality. So even when we say the word, that Jesus is calling us to love, he certainly isn't talking about romantic love, right? So it is this, to me, that it's one of those things that heightens it extends the Torah, because one of the ways that I think we as human beings oftentimes function is we get into situations where, just tell me the rules. Just tell me the rules. If I know the rules, I'm fine, and I can follow the rules, and I don't have to think about things. And that's the beauty of, again, what they talk about when they get into the eye for an eye conversation, because they raise all sorts of, what if this, what if that, what if the person who gets poked in the eye is already blind, so it doesn't matter, and because of that, that's the piece to me, that where love enters into the conversation about, it just keeps forcing you to have to ask, well, how do I love God? How do I love my neighbor? It isn't just, well, I checked off the 10 to-do list that I have to do, and now I'm good. It says, well, but if you get caught in this situation, what are you going to do? How do you love God? How do you love your neighbor? I mean, it's always there.
Yeah, I just want to. The eye for an eye thing is fascinating because I have lived literally my entire life. Well, since I've been a rabbi, anyway. Welcome to my world, by the way, with these confusing analogies. But the answer we are taught in rabbinical school of eye for an eye is the traditional rabbinic answer, although there are many, which is that it's totally about compensation. It's almost exclusively about money, that you are responsible for harming someone, and if you cause bodily harm, you have to pay for all the different aspects of recovery, whether it's medical help, whether it's time off from work. You have to compensate for that. You have to compensate for other issues that come up in terms of childcare, things like that. Anyway, all of those, it's all about money. And in this chapter, I read some commentaries that I hadn't really thought about much, and that is, well, that's unfair if someone is poor. That it weighs it too heavily in favor of the rich person. And we are told in the Torah, in our Bible, that we should not favor rich or poor. So a rich person who can, just write a check and say, here, this will pay for everything, it means nothing to that person. We think of Alex Jones. Let's say that the damage that he has caused, it's in today's news as well. I mean, but it's last few months. I don't think $1 billion is enough for him to pay, because he's got to feel the pain in a way, as well as, there's a punitive aspect to it as well. So anyway, I just thought that was fascinating with eye for an eye, but I still do not think that the Torah at any time was really talking about bodily mutilation as a revenge for loss of a limb.
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. And I think that that's a fascinating conversation too, about there's some really great books probably in the last 40 years, um, excuse me, have been written about the social context of the Gospels and the communities to which the Gospel writers are writing, and it gets at that whole issue of, what do you do about the whole class structure in first century Palestine, the role of women, or the lack of any freedom for women? Yeah, what about those who are poor, those who are marginalized? It's um, we read these stories and it's like, oh, well, this is what it means. Well, there's the backstory that we don't even know we don't know, unless we do, some digging.
Mark, I was thinking the whole eye for an eye, that's such a visceral image that it's hard to think about that concept in any other way than some kind of horrible retribution. And that's not really what it was about. It was a legal principle that was meant to, I think, set some standards of justice. I mean, how do you deal with being wronged? And so an eye for an eye really puts limits on the awful things people could do, in a retribution kind of sense. So, I think that's a helpful way to think about eye for an eye. That's really a roadblock into doing really awful things. And that was its legal intent.
Mm-hmm. And it's a little, I'm just was trying to move along because, well, the adultery stuff, I mean, at the end we get to the eye for an eye, and and it really is about less violence. One of the ways of interpreting it is, you're right about the legal piece, but that if you think about evolution of humanity, and you got to write down the rules, right? So something happens, so you got to write the rule down so that people will follow it in the future. One of the interpretations is, right, it's you killed my brother, I'll kill your family. You kill my family, I'll wipe out your whole tribe. And so it's right, it's about trying to lessen violence. And we hear it as fairly violent, but it's actually something that was meant to be, in a way, restorative, and which I think is also another interesting piece, because I've got it on one of the slides that comes up, but the point they make about the study that was done in 2014 on capital punishment, and that people use an eye for an eye as, majority of the people use that as an excuse for why we should have capital punishment. And you think about the context that the authors have given us around where did this rule come from? How has it been interpreted? Why is it about, it's about, monetary retribution. And yet, for many people, it is still a thing that is, that's what justice is. It's an eye for an eye. And maybe as Dwayne, you're saying, it's not physical. And as you said, Josh, not mutilation, but it is, that has to be our standard. And that's the other thing I think about, the evolution of thought, so that if Jesus is extending some of the Torah in his teaching on the mountain, it also follows that maybe there's stuff that Jesus says that also could be extended in our time. Ways of hearing what he had said, or ways of hearing the other prophets, and that our context requires a different way of thinking. And I do think that one of the things that's come up in our society over the last probably 30, 40 years has been restorative justice versus retributive justice. And how that makes so much more sense than again, just hurting people or locking them up, or how it is that we treat people.
I'd love to dig into turning the other cheek. I mean, I don't know what the order you have here, but in connection to eye for an eye, I have always understood it as not passivity per se, but pacifistic passivity, or active pacifism. I'm not, I see it in a Gandhi sense, which I've always respected, although I'm not sure, and Martin Luther King, I mean, nonviolent resistance, but also I'm sort of repulsed by it. And this came up a couple of years ago, 4 years ago exactly, in fact, with the Pittsburgh synagogue attack. And the church from Charleston visited those who had been attacked only a year or two before, a couple of years before, and they came up and they the people in Pittsburgh, the Jewish community of Pittsburgh, needed to understand, how do we respond to this killer who was sitting in front of them in a courtroom, around then. And they talked about how they forgave him. This whole notion of sort of turning the other cheek, how the Charleston victims forgave their killer. And the Jewish community in Pittsburgh said, we can't do that. That's so opposed to what we as Jews would want to do, and that what our tradition teaches us, not so much to gain revenge. It's not about eye for an eye, but it's about the killers having to ask for forgiveness, having to do teshuvah, having to pay the price in some way or another. That it's not ours to forgive and just turn the other cheek. It's anyway. So I'd love to get into that, because it seems like here, the authors are saying that Jesus is not really advocating pacifistic passivity in any sense, but that he's talking about agency, about doing something, and that turning the other cheek, where the offhand is used as a slap, is a way of sort of almost taunting the perpetrator by saying, "Oh yeah, you can do that, but you can't really hurt me," and sort of diffusing, in a sense, the situation in that way. I wasn't really sure I totally understood where they were going with this.
Well, I think that's what, yeah, that to me, that was the read that I had on it as well. I got that at number 2. It's about, it's not about physical mutilation. It's about the public humiliation. And as you said, it's the slap, the suit, and then the subjugation. Those are the three examples that they give. Turning your cheek, offering up your coat, and walking the extra mile. Those are the 3 examples that he gives. And that was my read on what they were saying, Josh, is that it really is about maintaining your agency when you are harmed, and that it's about agency and about shame, and shaming the people who do things to you. And I think that too is probably something that is lost to the 21st century in terms of that first century context, where Jesus would be talking about those things, or that you could have those kinds of relationships. They talk about, the slap. It was done in a way that the master would do it to the slave, or the soldier to the peasant. And then they get into this really interesting stuff about, like, if the slave were injured in a certain way, that then you would sell the slave, or free the slave as a part of the dealing with it, because it was about the relationship, and what would the slave would basically prefer to die rather than be enslaved by the individual. I think that there is a lot to do with the shame and the agency that is a part of first century Palestine.
They talk about the goal. Sorry, go ahead, Dwayne.
I was just going to say, think of what Martin Luther King did in his tactics during the civil rights, and all of the times when, crowds of Black people would be beaten senselessly, and there would be no physical recourse, none. But that behavior by the abuser was all exposed. And in that came huge public shame. I mean, people saw this on their TV sets and were repulsed by it. So it was interesting that, it was the shame factor, I think, that's how I'm thinking about it anyway, after reading this material, that really was part of the agency for change. So I just interesting, just expose how brutal the other is. And that's the point.
And it seems like the goal here, and the way it's explained, is not to shame specifically as the end result, but to de-escalate the conflict. You know, the shame is a means toward that end of de-escalating the conflict. Ultimately, I think that, you know, that's a way for me to understand turning the other cheek that I can accept much more than this passivity of allowing someone who is pummeling you to continue pummeling you. It just hasn't worked for Jews. I can tell you that.
No,
Um,
nowhere is Jesus saying that you should be a doormat.
Mm.
I don't think that's the kind of pacifism we're talking about.
Mm.
so does embarrassing someone who is acting as a brute de-escalate? You know, does shaming de-escalate? And that's an interesting question for today too. You know, when you know, we see so many people where it's almost as if the meanness, you know, is the purpose, is the that whole expression. You know, the responses of some people to the attack on Pelosi. You know, did the shaming of those people de-escalate things? Did it bring out people's better angels? You know, I mean, politically, I don't know if it has, but you know, I think in terms of violence, maybe it does. Maybe, especially for religious leaders like us, shame people. It can help to lower the temperature somewhat.
Well, and I think you're right, Josh. There are people probably who are beyond shame, right? And we talk about them as psychopathic or sociopathic, and but for most humans, and I think that's also part of what they're, at least the authors are driving at, is that the shaming one another is you're tapping into something about their humanity that they have, they feel something, right? And that part of what they're trying to get at is that you as a person are standing up for your humanity in that sense. You know, and maybe it's not a way that, you know, you might do now, or again, whatever the context is, but that's one of the ways that they interpret it, is that for the person who's being slapped, turning the other cheek is a way that says, you're not going to destroy my humanity. And because it engages the humanity of the other, if there is an element of humanness with them, then they would experience some type of shame. And I think that, you know, your example, Dwayne, is about the protests in the 60s and resistance. There's a classic picture of one of the sheriffs or deputies who has a German Shepherd, and he's lunging at this black boy. And there's a story behind that I read, that, you know, it looks like the dog is about to, you know, bite the boy. But it's that if the backstory that I read is correct, it's about the boy actually instigating that, so that there would be that picture. You know, that was part of the training at certain points, is to engage in a peaceful manner, but also to create that, so that, to your point, if people see it, they're abhorred by it. If they're, you know, any feeling human being. And I think with regard to the shaming in terms of social media, again, people, you know, Musk will continue to do whatever he does, but perhaps there also is a monetary value that's placed on, you know, you can go so far, but then there's a point at which people are like, no, that's it. And people will feel that.
I've never heard that story before about the dog in the South. I think we're going to hear from the Dog Anti-Defamation League that it was put in a awkward position.
Right. So we got the slap, we got the giving people your coat, and they pick up on Walter Wink has written a number of books, and I guess his theme is the third way in terms of working through these things. and not to go to court, but give the cloak, and literally it sounds like you're stripping down, and you're embarrassing people in that way. And then again, this whole context of the walking the extra mile in the person's shoes, that they compel you to do this. The example that was given is that the Roman soldiers who take Simon of Cyrene from the crowd as Jesus is taking the cross to Golgotha, and impel him to be the one who carries it. And so, again, there's that idea about, you sought to treat me as less than human, but I'm going to show you that I still have agency. Yeah, Josh, I'm not exactly sure how far I go with it, but
Yeah, I mean, I just reading Jesus' words. I mean, he was obviously, he had very high standards. Maybe it's his parents, they sort of held him up. That's what Jewish parents do sometimes. But to not just give a tithing, not just to give money charitably, but to give without restraint, to give all, in a sense, going above and beyond. That's fascinating, to set that high a standard for being charitable. And they go on the whole question of adultery and lust. We talked about anger leading to murder. It seems like lusting in your heart is of course dangerous, but that it's almost equated to the act of acts, acting on your lust. It brings back, to mind Jimmy Carter's magazine article as he was running for president, when he confessed to lusting in his heart, which in terms of Jewish ethics would be okay, as long as you don't act on it, you haven't committed a sin. Is the message here that we have to have a higher standard than how you act, and that is just what you intend or what you think?
Well, and the other part is that what's hyperbole and what is kind of reality, or the setting the bar that high. That in the slide here, they do talk about giving everything, give to everyone who begs, do not refuse anyone, sell all that you own. But there's also, again, the context there is they reference the Jubilee year, right? And in Judaism, and well, how often did that happen? It was something to aspire to, but was it ever a reality? And clearly there were people who were already trying to figure out ways around the Jubilee year, because they had the prophets talking about, stop doing that. And I think that, when we get into, for instance, the story about the man who fulfills Torah, but then Jesus says to him, well, then sell everything you got, and follow me. And he can't. So does that mean that we all should do the same thing? Or is Jesus making the point, that we all have that element within ourselves, even when we are so righteous as the young man was? There's still something that we, prevents us from giving ourselves completely.
I think hyperbole is a good way to put it, and I think often hyperbole is used. As long as we don't understand hyperbole without teeth to it, because it is meant to move us in the direction of how Jesus defines the kingdom of God. And it is a higher righteousness. We're being called to something more than the way the world would typically work. Even the way the law would typically work. Jesus seems to be, pushing those envelopes, I think, in his interpretation with the extension of it. We had talked earlier about, Mark, you had mentioned that, love is kind of the major principle, love God and love neighbor as self. And in that, the law is fulfilled. And I think this calling to a higher righteousness is an invitation into a very mature kind of faith that does in fact lean into the kingdom of God. and it's grounded ultimately on care for one another, because a lot of those extensions are for the sake of another. And what's radical about it is that we're being called to do that in spite of the actions of the other. And that's what grace is: extending love to someone who is not deserving. That's what grace is. And that's how we understand our relationship with God, or God's relationship with us, loving us, even though we do not fill, we're called to perfection. Jesus talks about, as God is perfect, so you too must be perfect. Well, we're called to that because that's what we aspire to. It's to lead us and help us lean into the direction of the kingdom, which is ultimately grace. And so, in a strange kind of way, this makes sense to me at the 30,000 foot level. When you get down into the specifics, it sounds kind of nuts at times, because you start taking this literally and are parsing it in a way that I think isn't necessarily to be taken so literally, that the hyperbole lifts us another place. In the same way, talking about the Jubilee every 50 years, even though it was never practiced, doesn't mean that's not just a powerful image that moves us in a gracious direction. So that's kind of how I view some of this. In fact, a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, same kind of material that you have to wrestle with. So that, one of the things that I did was go back and look at some of my sermons on the Sermon on the Mount, just to say, what did I do with some of this material? Without the benefit of having just read this chapter. And I'm wondering if the next time I preach on this, it's going to look very differently, probably because of the common ground of Christian and Jew, as Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, is doing what Jewish rabbis do in interpreting it. And so what is it that Jesus is doing in the interpretation, and how is he helping us or exhorting us to lean into the way of the kingdom?
I love that whole idea of this really just being laying out a vision for somewhat of a utopian world that may not really be where we are yet. The Jubilee year is, I think, part of that within the Torah is trying to do that, but also this this sort of gray area between law and love that that the authors are really trying to get us to embrace. That it's not the Old Testament of law and the New Testament of love. In fact, that there's an awful lot of law in the New Testament and expectations of people's behavior, and in within the Torah, I mean, one of the commandments actually is to love your neighbor, actually more than one, to love God. The ahavta, the word means you shall love. That is that is the key prayer that Jews recite several times every day. The Shema, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. It's a command of an emotion, but it's not really an emotion, because love is expressed in actions, in deeds, in performance of mitzvot. So that I think they really set this up for us, that we're able to to find that middle ground and appreciate that there is an awful lot that we share here.
I was thinking too, as you're talking, Dwayne, the whole idea of the kingdom, some people think about it as, and Christians especially, there's a group that it's beyond us and it's out there. And I think that there's a real recovery of that it exists here, when we do those things that you mentioned, when we embody those commands that embody the kingdom. So love, or the caring for people, the poor, the widow. And I was thinking, Josh, about tikkun olam, and that idea of repairing the world, and that so there's that's also a part of the command, and that perhaps that's also when Christians think of the kingdom not as something out there, but it is present here, that we're also participating in that as well.
Yeah. I want to mention capital punishment. I mean, all of these could be a whole session unto themselves, but you sort of made reference to it, Mark, very quickly with eye for an eye, since it's brought up in that survey in 2014, that was one reason why so many support capital punishment, grounding it in their faith, in their traditions. And so I'm glad that in the book they make it very clear that capital punishment has always been nearly non-existent in Jewish legal circles, even though it appears often in the Torah, but it's almost never enacted, just as punishing an adulterer is never really enacted, because you need to have witnesses, and unless they're really kinky, you don't have that usually. So but the same thing with capital punishment, you need to have witnesses warning them ahead of time, and clearly that they understand the act that they're about to perform, and the witness has to guide them through it almost in order for them to be valid witnesses. So it was said of the Sanhedrin, the courts of 70, that if they if they sent one person to death in 70 years in capital punishment, that was considered like a hanging judge, a hanging court. So it almost never happened in Jewish history. Whenever we've had control of our own, of our own legal avenues, but that's one reason that people stereotype the Old Testament as being, a book of vengeance and a legalistic book. So, is there a standard perspective on capital punishment that you come out of seminary understanding, or is it sort of all over the map?
I would say that it's all over the map. I think where Dwayne and I went to seminary, I would imagine that if you were to poll most of the people, they would be opposed to the death penalty, and and for a lot of reasons. But I think within, again, the irony of these more evangelical or fundamental Christians, that their read on that is that's how they see it, is an eye for an eye, therefore it has to be this way. And I think, to be fair, in terms of interpreting those actions on the part of some, it's not a thought out argument. It is more of a simplistic reading of text, which is the text says it, therefore we should do it. And they don't, they're not challenged on it. And I just think that that's, as far as kind of Christian exegesis and understanding interpretation, it's really unfortunate, because
it's such a handy text too, if you've been harmed some way, where someone has taken, say, the life of a loved one. I mean, you'd in your anger and your hurt, you would grab that kind of a text and use it to get even.
Yeah, and as we've, the authors have shown, and we've talked about tonight, is that that's not what the text is talking about.
No.
So,
but that's how it's used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much we talked about it, but we've referenced, I think, Christian nationalism too. And one of the things that I've seen in passing, just some of the statistics that they're showing, and how people are self-reporting as like Christian nationalists, or that they subscribe to that view, but they don't go to church. They really don't know much of what's in the Bible. So you've got an element, kind of a subset of a certain element of Christianity that has become really divorced from the roots of the religious tradition, and they're really more of a political entity. But they use the language of Christianity, and they abuse it.
So I wonder if anyone who's on board here has any questions. If you'd like to talk or write into the chat, either way, feel free to just open up your mic and ask.
During the early rabbinic era, what if the victim refuses monetary retribution and demands physical retribution?
I don't think that person would have a say in in the ultimate justice that's meted out by the rabbinic courts. That there was in the biblical era places. There was a place you could go to certain cities to be safe from retribution. Those were pretty common in ancient times. But once you get into the rabbinic period, it's not nearly as harsh a society. So someone would have to sort of toe the line. But thanks, Norman, for the question.
Other questions?
Josh, how early in rabbinic tradition did it move from something of retribution to financial compensation, with the primary question being what is fair? In what is fair seemed to be emphasized in the reading.
Yes.
And was that a what is fair? Was that an early question asked? And if so, is capital punishment ever fair? Is that why it was not practiced, or Judaism would be opposed to it? Where does the fairness come in?
Yeah, in terms of the capital punishment, it was never taken off the books. For the most part, the rabbis would say that, God will mete it out in God's own way, whether through an accident or, natural disaster or whatever, or guilty conscience, I don't know. But for the most part, it would not be carried out by a human court. They didn't have the power, the political power, to do that either. Especially in the Roman period. Once you get into Babylonia, there was a little bit more autonomy, and we're talking like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. The Jewish communities had some autonomy, but mostly for civil cases, not for something that would involve capital punishment anyway. So it was mostly theoretical, and because of that, they could really just use it as an exercise of the mind in trying to imagine the society they would have if they did have that power. Of course, that power didn't come to pass until 1948. Now the state of Israel is a Jewish state, and they have to really come to grips with questions like this. So any other questions? So this has been a lot of fun. I'm glad we could do this. We have 26 devices online right now. That's great, because I look around and I recognize some names more than others, so I know that it's a nice mix. And I'll be getting the video up onto YouTube, and we'll send the link. I put the last week's link in the chat here if you want to click on it, and you'll have it in your browser. Any other comments, questions, final remarks?
Josh, I think there were quite a few that came on after you had mentioned that, the three of us have been talking about continuing this, probably the very end of January, early February. We'll do a few more sessions, and most likely based on this book, since there's just endless material there. So we are planning on something.
Yes, thank you to both of you for being a part of it, and thanks again, everyone, for joining. And may we continue to grow in our understanding.
Absolutely, and wishing the two of you and everyone here very joyous holidays and good holidays. The great thing about this kind of dialogue is that there's never going to be a time of year when we're not going to have some holidays coming up.
Yeah.
But these are intensive months of holidays, especially for you. And so we will come back to this book. I think we've done a good job of advertising the book. I hope that you'll buy it because I feel really guilty again about having printed so much of it and shared so many chapters with all of you. But it really is, it's worth your reading. And then maybe suggesting to us which chapters you'd like us to discuss.
Maybe one of the things, Josh, we should talk about is, what does "thou shalt not steal" mean?
Well, if it's for educational purposes.
I see.
Yeah, okay. I guess I need to buy about 26 copies of the book and distribute it to all of you.
That's what the financial restitution is, and what is fair, right?
A chapter for a chapter.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. I'm going
Thanks,
to end
everyone.
the session. Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Have a good
Bye.
night.
Bye.